afternoon, and welcome to this NonIP webinar, sponsored by Transaction Network Services, where we will take a look at the compliance requirements with the, here's a mouthful, Telephone Robocall Abuse, Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence Act, or TRACED Act, the bipartisan legislation passed in December 2019 to protect the American people from the threat of illegal robocalls. My name is Chris Shipley. I'm an attorney and policy advisor for NonIP, the Internet and Competitive Networks Association. Today's presentation marks the last in an informal trilogy of presentations that NonIP has had on robocall mitigation and call authentication in 2020. And it's an appropriate bookend as we bring back Steve Augustino from Kelley Drye and a representative of TNS who gave us a preview of what to expect with regards to the TRACED Act's many requirements of the FCC at the NonIP Policy Summit back in March. As we'll get to in just a moment, it's been a busy year as the FCC has worked diligently to meet these requirements. And our presentation will take you through the robust regulatory framework that the Commission has established to mitigate illegal robocalls and further protect consumers from harm. I'm joined today by two experts that will walk us through the compliance requirements for the TRACED Act and also discuss some of the products that are being employed to bring companies into compliance with recent Commission actions on call authentication and call blocking. First, Steve Augustino is a partner with Kelley Drye Warren and the co-host of the firm's Full Spectrum podcast. Steve is also one of the co-authors of a matrix, very helpful matrix I might add, that Kelley Drye put together that summarizes the nearly 24 TRACED Act related rulemakings and proceedings required of the FCC. We're lucky to have him back here at the end of the year to discuss the FCC's progress on meeting the Act's statutory requirements. Steve, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also joining us is Lavinia Kennedy, the Director of TNS Robocall Detection and Authentication Services. Lavinia, thank you for being here today and discussing some of the products that TNS has developed to combat illegal robocalls.
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to these two for their presentation, I want to encourage webinar participants to submit questions into the chat or Q&A functions on Zoom. And once we've completed the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as possible. Now it's my great pleasure to turn the presentation over to Lavinia, who will tell us more about TNS and the work that the company is doing to assist voice service providers in eliminating illegal robocalls. Lavinia?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank Chris and NonIP for hosting this webinar and inviting Steve and I to participate. My name is Lavinia Kennedy. I have product management responsibilities for the identity and protection product suite at TNS. This includes Call Guardian, our robocall mitigation solution. Today, we want to talk to you about compliance with the TRACED Act and what do you need to do and what do you need to know in order to comply with the recent FCC orders. The webinar will have two sessions. One, the first part, Steve is going to give an overview of the order. Steve is our outside counsel with Kelley Drye. And like I said, he'll provide an overview of the orders. The second part of the webinar, I'll provide an overview of the tools that TNS developed and deployed in the market today. And I'm going to focus on how they can help you comply with the TRACED Act. And I think in the end, Chris will moderate a Q&A session for about 15 minutes or so. So that's the plan for today. I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to talk to us for the first part of the session.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lavinia. Thank you to NonIP. Always happy to be participating and speaking at NonIP events. And thank you everybody who has joined this. There's a lot of information. I will reiterate what Chris said, that is, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them right away, and we will do our best to answer them as in this session, or if not, then afterwards. We can move on to the next slide here. I'm going to start with talking about the TRACED Act and the requirements that are in it, but we really want to focus mostly today on the left-hand side of this, this slide here, which is the shaken, stir, or stir shaken call authentication frameworks and the role that that's going to play. That has been the most recent actions by the FCC. It's the ones that have the most far-reaching impacts on the network and on call flows. So we're going to spend time on that. But as Chris noted, the TRACED Act has many other provisions that are designed to address unlawful robocalls and to really to bring trust back to the voice network. That's the goal here in making sure that consumers can trust the calls they're receiving and can trust the network, and frankly want to answer calls again, even from ones where they don't recognize the call originator on it. So that jump forward, let's go back a little bit. Stay back on that slide right there. So the core on the on the right hand side, what the FCC has to do covers a lot of different things to protect consumers, to implement a number of different know your customer type arrangements, things like that, and also to pursue offenders. And they got more power out of the TRACED Act to do that. But on the stir shaken side, the core piece of this is that Congress endorsed what had been the FCC's goal, which was to implement this call authentication framework. And the core piece of that is due to be implemented on June 30th of 2021. So this coming June, the end of June, it needs to be implemented. That is a really tight time frame, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that time. There are exemptions, and now let's go to the second slide. I'm going to talk about when you have to do it first, and then I'm going to talk more about the what and in what context you need to do it. So June 30th of 2021 is the core deadline, and that was adopted by the FCC in the first order, and it was actually in the statute itself that 18 months was when it had to be implemented. So there really wasn't much discussion on that. There was a lot of discussion on what kinds of extensions the FCC would adopt and could extend. The main one here, there are 4 overall, but the main one is for small voice service providers. Small voice service providers with under 100,000 subscriber lines in total, and that runs across all affiliates, receive a 2-year extension from the implementing stir shaken. It doesn't mean you have nothing to do for 2 years. And frankly, as well as this, I'll show you, there's a lot of things that small voice providers have to do in the interim, but implementing the stir shaken is not required until 2023. For voice service providers who can't obtain the SBC tokens that are used in the authentication framework, the extension is indefinite, but it's only until you're able to receive the token. And so that is an extension that could continue for some time, but it could go away fairly quickly depending upon how you implement, how you change things. For services that are being discontinued when the magic date comes around in June, there's a 1-year extension for those types of services. So those are the ones that are on the way out. It really doesn't make sense to implement new standards with respect to those services. And then stir shaken is something that only works on IP networks. So there is an indefinite extension for the non-IP network, but, and I'll talk about this again as well, the FCC has additional requirements, frankly, to encourage people to move to IP as quickly as possible. Now, the last thing on here is that the FCC can take other extension requests. They have requested, it's sort of a soft deadline, if you will, that those extension requests come in by this coming Friday, November 20th, and the Bureau will act upon those, and will act upon those by March. So we will know additional extensions or individual extensions by that time frame. So that's the big picture framework on this. Now, what do you have to do? To implement stir shaken, there are 3 core elements to it. First, if you're a voice service provider, and voice service provider, by the way, covers just about everything. It is intended to be broad. It covers VoIP. It covers traditional common carriers. It covers additional carriers as well. So it's intended to be as broad as possible for the FCC. The first thing you have to do is you have to authenticate and verify SIP calls that originate and terminate on your own network. So those don't necessarily technically have to be stir shaken, but they do have to be authenticated in that time frame. If you're on the originating side of the call, you have to authenticate that SIP call and put it into the stream with the authentication information. If you're on the terminating side of it, implementing stir shaken means that you're going to verify those calls that you receive in SIP according to the framework of the stir shaken. So all of this really depends upon the functions, what you're doing. You can be an originating provider for some calls, terminating for others, and you can be an intermediate for other calls as well. Now, with respect to intermediate providers, their main obligation is to pass the authentication information unaltered so that it can continue all the way to the termination side and the terminating carrier can do the verification that is required. But intermediate providers also must authenticate unsigned calls that it receives. There's a minor exemption to this. The intermediate provider can avoid this if it's participating in the industry traceback group and responds to traceback requests, then you can continue to send unsigned calls. But generally speaking, the FCC wants to see more calls that are signed and wants that intermediate provider to sign those calls, both calls that it receives in SIP and calls that it receives in TDM and is handing off in SIP. Those should be signed. The FCC, if you're an intermediate provider, this is potentially a value add for you. And many intermediate providers are looking to be able to provide the highest attestation available and consistent with the standards there. So the FCC actually said you're not required to give a gateway attestation. You can do more if you have the information and it meets the standards on that. So intermediate providers look, I think, real closely at how you're going to handle those unsigned calls, what kind of labels you're going to put on that, and what you're capable of doing under the stir shaken framework. That's important here. Let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk about the non-IP portion of the network. The FCC stuck with the June of 2021 deadline there and said that if you're a carrier, you have two choices really. You can upgrade the rest of your network to IP. And that is, I think, the best strategy where it's possible. It's obviously not going to be possible everywhere, but if you can upgrade, you should upgrade to that. But if you're not going to upgrade, then the obligation is to participate in developing a call authentication framework for non-IP calls. And that hasn't been developed yet. There's a lot of questions as to how that's going to be done. But what the commission right now is saying, well, you should be participating in that. The good news is that you can participate through your trade association. So if you're a member of INCOMPAS and INCOMPAS is going to be participating in that process, then that will count towards your obligation of fulfilling with respect to your non-IP portions of the network. But what everybody has to do if you haven't implemented stir shaken is for those non-IP calls, you have to have a reasonable robocall mitigation program in place. And I'm going to talk in a minute about what those obligations are. So come June 2021 in your IP network, you're going to have stir shaken implemented. In your non-IP network, to the extent that that still exists, you're going to have some kind of a robocall mitigation program in place. Let's move to the next slide, where we will talk about what those elements are of the robocall mitigation program. So the FCC only outlined 3 elements to it. and they did it at a very high level. So you're going to have to develop the program that fits within your network and works within your customer base and your capabilities. But there are three core elements to what you need to do. First, you have to be taking reasonable steps to avoid originating illegal robocall traffic. Now, that's going to mean that you're going to need to know something about your customer. You're going to need to know something about the traffic that is being originated. You should look at the data that is available on the quality of that traffic, the types of that traffic, elements of that traffic in terms of like completion rates and average duration could be relevant there in setting forth this. Secondly, for a robocall mitigation program, you have to commit to respond to that industry traceback group again. So for those calls that you're originating, you have to commit to being responsive when you get those requests saying, who's the customer, where'd you get it from, if you were the intermediate carrier, et cetera. And then lastly, and this is something that I think is going to grow over time, you have to not only respond to the request, but you have to then cooperate in further investigating those calls and in stopping those illegal robocallers. And this is something we have seen the FCC do in a few extreme cases so far, where they are identified a specific provider and say, you have a customer who's originating illegal traffic, and they gave them 48 hours to do one of two things: either cut off that customer, or we're going to authorize other carriers to block all of your traffic. That's pretty extreme, but I do think that that kind of active practice of stopping illegal robocallers is going to become more and more important, and something that all carriers are going to have to develop. Now, within this, as I said, the FCC has said they're not going to mandate specific things, but they did specifically say that they view call analytics as something that could be helpful, and they encourage people to implement reasonable call analytics as part of your robocall mitigation program. And that's significant, and Lavinia will talk a little bit more about what that might mean for you individually. And then move on, Lavinia. This is really kind of, this is a new thing, and this could be really tricky depending upon how the FCC ends up implementing it. The commission has decided that in order to implement these requirements that I just talked about, they're going to impose a certification requirement. All voice service providers are going to be required to provide a status update, filing presumably through a portal similar to the way that CVAA certifications are provided for disabilities access, the way that the CPNI certifications have been provided recently. But that's the functionality that hasn't been determined exactly. The compliance date on that hasn't been set yet. It's a new information collection, so it's subject to the OMB review, and we'll have to go through the Paperwork Reduction Act to get there. But when that certification becomes effective, everybody will have to file. If you can certify that you have fully implemented stir shaken in all of your network, great, period, stop. That's all the extent of your obligations. But if you haven't implemented stir shaken fully, or if you're subject to one of the extensions that I talked about, the small carrier extension or the non-IP part of your network, then you must explain what's in your robocall mitigation program and explain how that will meet the goal of reducing unwanted illegal robocalls. So you will have to put in that certification the type of exemption, the specific steps you are taking to avoid originating illegal traffic. You'll have to commit again in that document to fully and timely respond to traceback requests and to cooperate in stopping illegal robocallers. Since this is filed with the FCC and it will be signed, certified by an officer, this is something the FCC could investigate. and could look at and ensure that you are doing something that is meaningful in this area. So I'd be very, very careful in what you write, and be very, very careful to make sure that you're actually doing what you say you're going to do. Now, the other way that this has teeth is that once a certification requirement becomes effective, everybody will have to certify by a specific date. And after that point, the FCC has said that they will prohibit carriers from passing traffic to a provider that failed to certify. So if you don't certify to this, then you're not going to be receiving traffic from certain carriers. They're going to be prohibited from passing that traffic to you. So if you're an intermediate carrier, for example, that could be devastating to your business. If you're serving your end users, that can be very problematic. So watch out for that. That is a pretty strong enforcement mechanism. If you're the carrier passing it along, you're going to have to now have mechanisms in place to make sure that the partners that you interconnect with, that you're passing traffic to, have certified, and you have a way of testing that and making sure of that. So there's going to be a lot built into this certification requirement once it becomes final. We can move on now. I'm going to talk just for a minute about a couple of other open issues, then I'm going to turn it over to Lavinia and let her talk about how you would try to implement many of these requirements that I put out there. So what's left with respect to stir shaken, or how does this all work? Well, first of all, the North American Numbering Council has provided recommended best practices for how you go about authenticating those calls, what type of information you should have, how you would collect that. The FCC received that recommendation in compliance with the deadline of the TRACED Act, and then has put it out for comment. It received comment last month in October. I don't know yet whether the FCC is just going to issue a public notice or it's just going to allow it to continue. At this point, we will see. That document is something I would recommend you be looking at in developing your own practices and looking at your robocall mitigation, for example, as well. International gateways, there's some interesting issues going on there because foreign originated traffic is potentially a problem. It's coming in largely not through the traditional gateways at this point, but once those other routes get shut off, there is a worry by the gateway providers that the traffic are going to try and be routed through them instead. And so the international gateways are looking at how they can participate meaningfully in this process, getting the access to the tokens, what happens with international standards. I know GSMA has been developing a separate standard that would cover, largely a lot of calls coming from Europe. And so how's that going to be implemented? What happens with the differences in that? So that's all under development. That will be future orders, honestly, probably not in the near term. And this last point here, I'm sorry, I put it in two places. It was so important. Once that certification requirement comes in, there is going to be a restriction on you sending calls to other providers who are not participating. The foreign service providers, the FCC has tried to find a way to encourage them to file certification, even though they're not required to. And so they have proposed to block carriers from accepting calls directly from a foreign service provider who has not filed a certification voluntarily. So that's really a lot more to look at in the nature of the international calls, international originated calls. And all I can say right now is, I guess, more will be coming in that area. And I think that is everything, Lavinia. I think it's on to you at this point.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about how TNS can help carriers meet these FCC requirements. And like I said, I'm going to focus on what you need to do to comply with the TRACED Act. Let me just summarize the 4 things that Steve mentioned that the FCC is looking for. So the FCC is looking for a carrier to completely upgrade their non-IP network to IP and implement STIR/SHAKEN on its entire network before June 30th, 2021. And if that's not completed, they're looking for a carrier to participate in the development of standards for the non-IP calls. That's the ADIS group subgroup that was created this year. And again, you can participate via a trade organization, or you can sign up for to join ADIS. And if you don't have STIR/SHAKEN deployed on your entire network, you have to certify that you have a robocall mitigation program in place. Also, you can upgrade to IP Interconnect wherever possible. So let me move forward here, and so there are, I think, 3 questions that customers will need to answer. And those are, have I implemented a call authentication framework? What are the details around that? And how do I show the FCC that I have fully deployed STIR/SHAKEN on my network? Do I have a robocall mitigation strategy for my non-IP portion of the network? And lastly, am I going after bad actors initiating calls on my network? And if you are, how are you doing that? And what are you gonna, how are you gonna present that to the FCC? I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what TNS is doing in the market today. So these are products that we have deployed in the market today. I'm going to start on the left-hand side with call blocking. So this is very basic call treatment where we score calls, and we have a machine learning algorithm. I'm going to talk about that a little later on, but we can help you identify negative or bad traffic that terminates on your network, and you have the ability to block those calls. We can also warn the subscriber. So for the calls that we don't want to block, we can display either potential spam or a scam or some kind of indicator to let the subscriber know that the intent of the call, we can let them know the intent of the call, and we can say you may or may not want to answer this call. We also have deployed in the market the Call Guardian Authentication Hub. So this is a hosted environment. TNS is hosting this environment, and we have small and medium carriers that take advantage of not only robocall mitigation, but they also can deploy STIR/SHAKEN. So this is like I said, a one-stop shop. You can get your calls signed and verified. We're an approved SDICA via our partnership with Metaswitch. I'll talk about that a little later. And then you can do universal call block. You can do advanced call treatment. You can do advice the risk, which is letting the subscriber know that this may be a spam or scam call. We also have web portals and reports that are customized to meet each carrier's need. Another product that we have in the market is the TNS IPX Voice Transit. So this will help you expedite your IP Interconnect deployment and increase your footprint to be able to deploy STIR/SHAKEN. We also have a mobile app. So for the carriers that are interested in deploying a mobile app, that's in the market today, and we provide a different customer experience where customers can not only see the calls that we think are spam or scam or fraud, but they have more control over blocking and interacting with the mobile app. They also provide feedback, which can then be shared with the carrier to see what the subscribers are saying. And then lastly, enrich calls. So this is where you would have the ability to provide a name or a logo or display intent of the call for consumers to see and interact with. Okay. Universal call blocking. So what do I mean by that? The FCC allows carriers to block high-risk calls. So TNS has, like I mentioned, an algorithm that scores calls on a scale. So we have, it's from +4 to -4, with a -4 being the worst of the worst. So these are the calls that are coming from not in use, do not originate, invalid, high volume spoofer characteristics, toll-free unallocated. We have a bunch of criteria that we put in there, primarily the ones that the FCC said that you can block. These calls do not reach the subscriber. They can be redirected to voicemail or blocked at the network level. The majority of the customers through the surveys that we've done over the last couple of years are telling us that they want these high-risk calls to be blocked. They don't want their device to ring. Some of them don't even want them sent to voicemail. So that's one way to apply call treatment. You can block the call, or you can send the call to voicemail. Another tool that I talked about was advice to risk. So this is where you provide the subscriber with additional information on the intent of the call. You can also layer in stir shaken inputs. So these are for the calls that are not high risk, but calls that you want to warn the subscriber, or calls that the subscriber tells you, I really, this is a nuisance call. I want you to tell me, so I can make a better decision. What we do with advice to risk is we work with a carrier to determine the appropriate mapping. So we analyze the traffic and decide, okay, for these types of calls, these types of categories, we would want to display something to the subscriber. For example, we may want to say potential spam to alert them. So that's another way to engage with the subscriber. And again, it doesn't require a mobile app. Another one of the tools was stir shaken. So this is where we have deployments in the market today, both in an in-network environment as well as the hosted environment. What I'm going to focus here on is mostly on the hosted environment. So the goal of stir shaken obviously is trust and traceability. We want to authenticate and verify using the STICA approved certificates. Stir shaken obviously doesn't work over TDM, but that's where analytics do. The intent of the call will still be present. Just a little overview of stir shaken. So the caller ID is signed by the originating service provider. It's verified by the terminating service provider. And the focus really is trust, which is presented in the attestation, verification status, and traceability, which is the orig ID. Our deployments in the market today, like I said, we partnered with Metaswitch, so their QCall product does the signing and verification in our hosted environment, and it is highly integrated with Call Guardian, which provides the analytics piece of it. So we have lots of carriers today that are doing trials. We have carriers that have signed production agreements, but really. What I want to show you here is that you have the stir shaken component as well as the reputation database, which provides call treatment. So, so you are doing both. You are doing the stir shaken piece, which the FCC mandated, but you're also layering in, which is really important because, as you know, stir shaken is not a silver bullet. So we recommend a layer approach in fighting illegal robocalls. So the analytics piece tells you the intent of the call, and then you can take further action. And the other tool that I had on the one of the overview slides was the IPX Voice. And what we've done here, if you look on the right-hand side, is we integrated our Call Guardian Authentication Hub with our Voice IPX. So this allows you to leverage not only stir shaken, but also the Call Guardian reputation algorithm to influence certificate-based trust. So here's where you can increase your footprint, your IP interconnects, and deploy stir shaken faster. In the meantime, you can also layer analytics. So you can communicate intent of the call to your subscribers. I included some information here on our analytics engine. As you know, we use data from multiple industry databases. We have some of the data sources that we use are based on crowdsourced feedback. So we take information that the subscribers are telling us about that call, and we leverage that into the algorithm. We use carrier partner data. for example, not in use numbers, and a variety of other things that carriers share with us. We have stir-shaken inputs that can influence and do influence the algorithm and how we score numbers. And we also have enterprise data. We have enterprise registration that also feeds into our algorithm, helping us making better decisions for the carrier and the subscribers. And let me see. Let's see what else I wanted to talk about. Okay, so I have two conclusion slides. Let me do this fairly quickly so we have some time for Q&A. There are three things that the FCC is asking for, and this is how we can help you comply. One of them is deploying stir-shaken on your IP portions of the network. Like I mentioned, the Call Guardian Authentication Hub is the product that really is a one-stop shop. Carriers can come in. It's a hosted environment, and they can really pick and choose. Some of them just want to do stir-shaken. Some of them want to do universal call block. Some of them want to do it all. They want to do stir-shaken, block the calls that are high risk, and also provide advanced call treatment, like redirect to voicemail calls that they deem are nuisance. And then display something to the subscriber for the rest of the calls using advice to risk. We have a web portal, we have custom reporting for them. They can use these reports to go to the FCC and show how they're protecting their network, what they're doing on the origination side as well as the termination side. For the non-IP or the TDM portions of the network, the FCC recommends the use of reasonable analytics. We can support multiple protocols that are in the market today in production. We have access to lots of reports that we've already developed that show your network traffic analysis, and you can take action on that. You can see where some of the bad actors originate traffic on your network. And we can also help monitor, again, on the origination side to see where the bad traffic is happening. We can also help with participation in the industry traceback efforts. The ITG group is part of the U.S. Telecom. TNS is a member of USTA. And we've helped customers implement know your customer processes as well, which is one of the items that you can put in your report for the FCC to show that you are, you know who's originating traffic on your network, and you have best practices in place. And lastly, I wanted to leave you with a conclusion slide that talks about, so the FCC mandated stir-shaken. This cannot be avoided. We have partnered with Metaswitch. I think it's almost a 2-year-old partnership at this point. And we understand stir-shaken. We've deployed stir-shaken from major carriers to very small carriers. We know how this applies to your network. We know how to attest your calls. We recommend a layered approach because one thing is not going to stop illegal robocalls, and there are different things that consumers and subscribers would want to see. So we can help with that. I think I've covered the rest of it. I mean, I have some information here on what the next steps are for a carrier in general, how they connect to our Call Guardian Authentication Hub. They would, do some basic testing. Then we talk about SIP interconnects. Then we figure out what types of calls you leave your network, enter your network, residential, enterprise. We go through all kinds of use cases, and we start with very basic test cases to begin with, and then we add as we feel more comfortable. And then as carriers feel more confident about deploying stir-shaken, we talk about, okay, what are you going to show to the subscriber? The subscribers are going to want to see something. You may want to tell the FCC that you're showing something on the device or in a mobile app. And then we take it one step at a time and see what the carrier plans to implement and what they want to show to the FCC. And we work with them every step of the way and make sure that they have everything they need to show compliance. I think that's all I have, Chris. I think I'm going to pass it back to you. Hopefully we have some time for questions.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we've got a few minutes, obviously, for questions and answers, and thank you both. That's all really compelling and interesting information. And I think more than anything, I think you're really starting to see the rubber meet the road when it comes to the FCC and expectations with respect to building in call authentication frameworks into your own networks. And so I appreciate you both offering your perspective and that information. We do have a few questions and answers in the chat right now, and I would encourage everyone to continue to submit those as I go through these a little bit. The one thing that I wanted to mention, Steve, this is from your fellow panelist at the Policy Summit, Jim Tyrell from TNS, correct, Lavinia? Jim's with TNS, correct?
He is, yes.
He sure is. The FCC announced on November 9th that the date to certify was going to be on December 1st. I'm not sure, Steve, if you had anything you wanted to follow up with respect to that sort of assertion that Jim was making.
Yeah, there's there we go. There's a couple of different certifications in here, and I might have created a little bit of confusion because I left out the sort of the short-term exemption language that comes out of the TRACED Act that allows carriers to certify that they are making progress towards implementing STIR/SHAKEN, and it formally relieves them of some of the deadlines to do so. But that process has a certification in December that you're making progress, and then a follow-up certification in June that you have achieved what you had said was your schedule on that. And I left that one out of the discussion here because that was a little bit different than some of the other things. And I thought the ones who were really having trouble implementing STIR/SHAKEN, or we're going to have the most significant changes in the network, are going to be doing so through the other processes. So I have not seen the FCC set up the certification standard for whether or not you've implemented STIR/SHAKEN, and when that 90-day, the critical 90-day deadline then is going to be for carriers who can pass traffic to other carriers. That's still to be determined at this point.
Great, I haven't seen it either, so appreciate you making that clarification. The second one comes from another one of our NCOMPAS members, Bob McCausland from Intrado, asks, there are some in the industry who are claiming that they can avoid adherence by splitting their traffic in a manner to classify that traffic as non-interconnected VoIP. Bob doesn't necessarily read the order to permit this. Wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah. It's a really good question, and thank you, Bob, for asking it. Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that. I will say I don't know. I don't know that anyone has started to do something like this. So I'm just going to give sort of a general response and thought process on that, which is that the FCC is very, very invested in STIR/SHAKEN. It is one of the major components in trying to stop illegal robocalls. It's not the only one, and as Lavinia pointed out, it's not a silver bullet. It at best is just going to make it possible to identify and trust what the originator is. It doesn't really say anything about the intent of that originator or what the call is out there. But it's important to the FCC. And I would think that efforts to try to manufacture an exemption from the requirements are going to be looked upon negatively by the FCC. So I'm skeptical that something like that would work. There are going to be enough problems already with international calls and with calls that are still in non-IP networks those are going to be big problems. And I don't see the FCC wanting to allow a new exemption to be created.
We did get the question, obviously, about whether or not the slides will be provided. If I remember correctly, Lavinia, if folks are interested in getting the slides, they can contact you, correct? You were on mute, but that is a head shake. I'm assuming in the affirmative.
Yes, yes.
Great, great. Jeff Buckingham asks a question about upgrading to an IP network. Their ILECs do not provide IP interconnection. And so how is the company supposed to upgrade to an all IP situation? He notes that they can hub their services through a company like IntelliQuint, but they are only hubbing TDM from the ILEC. Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a problem. In this proceeding, several commentators did ask the FCC to do more to encourage IP interconnection, at least, if not require it. The FCC did not go down that route with this order, however. So if there's nothing that I'm aware of that is going to require those interconnection partners of yours to change their own networks. They're facing the same mandate from the FCC, but if they choose to go the non-IP route with a robocall mitigation program, there's nothing to stop that, to stop that from happening.
And thank you, Jeff, for that question. The last one that I've got currently is from an anonymous attendee. Any insight as to what criteria is used to identify calls as spam or high risk during the authentication process? The basis for the question is to understand the possible impact of these new requirements and security overlays to companies making compliant marketing calls, i.e. at the request of the consumer, or potentially being misidentified as spam or high risk. Lavinia, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, nobody wants to block a legitimate call, and we have safeguards in place to prevent that. But so for TNS, our algorithm has, like I said, a scale and a scoring system, and we work with the carriers to identify their traffic, analyze their traffic, and kind of figure out, what % of their traffic that's remaining on their network is high risk. Do we want to block it? Do we feel comfortable blocking it? What are the false positives, false negatives in doing so? So there's a lot of analysis and research that goes into a carrier deploying something in the market that blocks calls. Now, for the calls that are labeled, yes, there's a lot of debate whether that call should be labeled or not, depending on who you are. So you have the subscriber that may say, I don't want this call. You have the carrier that says, well, I really want to enable the enterprise to complete that call, but my subscribers are saying this is a bad call. They don't want the call. And you have the enterprises that are saying every call that I make is legal. It should never be blocked. It should never be labeled. So what we do is we try and work with all sides, right? So of course we work with our carrier partners. They're our customers. We work with enterprises. We have a free process to register enterprises. So if you go to report@robocall.com, you can, as an enterprise, you can register for free. And there is some communication between TNS and the enterprises. And we have best practices that we share with them. Anyway, we're very involved in that space. So it really is a collaboration, and we spend time with the carriers as well as with the enterprises to show them and explain how we score numbers, why a number was labeled a certain way, what's the consumer feedback that validated that scoring or invalidated the scoring. And we change rating all the time, from making it negative, also making it positive. So it's not so it's a process we work with all sides.
Helpful. I had a couple of quick questions. I hope you all don't mind. I'm gonna try to get an answer on how the recording will continue to be made available to participants and to folks that are looking at it, and hope they answer that in just a second. Steve, in terms of the robocall mitigation plan, I mean, what is when you're working with your clients, you're working with voice service providers, what's your expectation for the amount of time it's going to take in order to put together a robocall mitigation plan and the materials that their FCC are going to eventually review to ensure that they're meeting the requirements of this most recent second report and order on call authentication.
I do think it's something that's going to take some thought, and it is going to be largely individualized in terms of what your network is, what your customer base is, what your mix of traffic looks like. So I think the first step is I would say you really kind of have to understand what your traffic looks like now and what your customers look like now. And you may not have much of that information at the outset, right? Because you may not collect a lot of information about how they're calling or why they're calling. That's where, analytics and other stuff may give you some information about what the traffic looks like, how it's being rated and classified at least, and that can help you there. So I think a fair amount of information is going to need to be done there. The FCC has indicated they're going to be non-prescriptive. So if you explain what your mitigation program is, what the pieces are, they don't seem to be that they're going to be dictating a lot of what those elements need to be. What they will be dictating is that you follow what you say. So if you say that you're going to collect certain information about customers, you need to follow that. If you say you're going to cut customers off after, certain types of complaints or certain triggers, then you need to be following that. And I think that's going to be the most important part of these plans, at least initially.
Great. Lavinia, I apologies if I didn't catch, you said, I think you said TNS is participating in the non-IP working group, correct? To try to identify solutions to call authentication in the non-IP portions of networks, correct?
Yeah, we participate via our partner Metaswitch. Mm-hmm.
That's great. And I was wondering, whether or not you had any update on the progress of that group or how the work is going with that group as they're obviously driving towards a solution as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are different options that are being considered. Again, it will take some time to develop a standard, but there is work being done in that group. Yes.
Yeah, certainly will take time, just as STIR/SHAKEN has.
Yes.
Last question for me. I'm curious, what further action do you think we can expect from the FCC? There's obviously a lot to look forward to and a lot to be aware of with respect to these requirements in 2021. There is a fourth further notice of proposed rulemaking out there on call blocking and a one-ring scam order that was on circulation for some time. I'm curious what you all sort of foresee as, what can we expect from the FCC in the last few months of what appears to be the current administration, and then in 2021 under a Biden administration?
I'll take a first shot at that. There is a lot, and you mentioned, there's a lot still on the checklist under the TRACED Act that needs to be completed. What Chairman Pai has always recognized, and I give him credit for this, is that it's a multifaceted approach to try to identify and stop these illegal calls. And it's harming everybody, but no single thing is going to fix that, right? STIR/SHAKEN is not going to stop the calls entirely. The reassigned number database isn't going to stop the problem. Even defining ATDS is not going to stop the problem, although it doesn't appear that the FCC is going to get to that in this under this leadership, at least. We've got the Supreme Court taking that up next month, and early in 2021 have some kind of an idea about that, which will show a little bit more about the scope of the problem there. So defining what is that. I realize I used a little bit of jargon there. I'm sorry, Chris, but defining the scope of the TCPA, calls which are automated calls, or what we're sort of colloquially calling robocalls. Although Not necessarily every robocall is a ATDS, and certainly not every robocall is illegal. So an automated telephone dialing system is the acronym that was in the statute for that automated call. And defining that, you still have to define what's that covered by, and that will lead to a lot of the questions under the TCPA and a lot of what the FCC is after. But you're asking what's going on. I think, there's been a lot of industry change with, the implementation of call blocking, with some call labeling issues, with stir shaking, with everything else. And so I think that, there's more to come on that. The industry is going to need to refine a lot of what they've done. I expect the FCC's shift in the early part of next year to be on compliance and enforcement instead, both going after those who are clearly originating the illegal robocalls, but also I think that focus on the carriers who are the originating carriers serving that customer. I don't see vicarious liability, but I do see a lot more duties to know what's happening in your traffic and to act quickly on that. And that can present itself in an enforcement-like context. So I do think it's important to really be looking carefully at what your mitigation program is going to be and when you're going to take actions.
Lavinia, any final thoughts? Want to give you the final word, perhaps?
No, I think we covered everything, Chris. Thank you.
Absolutely. The information here it was wonderful. I want to thank you both for today's webinar. The question was, will the recording be available? It will. Soon after the webinar is over, we're going to be uploading the webinar to YouTube, and we'll forward a link out to those of you that attended today. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Steve, and to thank you, Lavinia, for this wonderful chance to really highlight what's going to be a very busy 2021 when it comes to compliance with the TRACED Act and with the FCC's new rules and requirements on call authentication and call blocking. Want to encourage our members to reach out to our panelists today with their needs. And thank you all for attending today. We have another webinar coming up on Thursday on our broadband blueprint paper. I encourage you all to attend that event as well to find some of our thoughts about that. But really, thank you all for attending. And Steve and Lavinia, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.